And now that the Supreme Court is validating what he first said, he's acting like this is a shock. Like, how dare the Supreme Court declare this unconstitutional?
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
We got some other economic data I wanted to mention that I think the markets thought was a little bit stronger, and that was the GDP numbers that came out for the first quarter, and they were looking for an increase of 1.4%, and we actually got 2%. So that surprised the markets, mainly because of personal consumption expenditures. That was a bigger rise than they thought. They were looking for up 3.8%, and the number was up 4.2%. But again, a lot of this is just spending. All of the economic data, the production, the manufacturing numbers have been extremely weak. In fact, here's another one, the Richmond Fed Manufacturing Index for June, another negative month. It was minus 15 in May, and it was -7 in June. I mean, a little bit better than the -10 that they were expecting. But what's significant is that all of these numbers always begin with a minus sign. This is a weak economy. And in fact, one of the reasons that so many people are spending money is because a lot of people that have student loans still aren't making their payments. I mean, I can't even believe this. I'm reading all these articles about student loans, and maybe this is a good transition into these Supreme Court cases, but the moratorium on student loan interest payments and principal payments began during COVID, right? It was supposedly emergency. It was COVID, so people couldn't make their student loan payments. Of course, the irony of that is most people made more money during COVID than they did before COVID, because you had a lot of people who were receiving stimulus checks that were bigger than their paychecks. So they actually had extra money that they could have used to make their student loan payments, except they didn't have to make the payments. So not only did they get the extra money from the stimulus checks, but they got the extra money from not having to make any payments on their student loans. Same thing, a lot of small businessmen got these PPP loans. Maybe they had some student loans that they didn't have to make payments on, and they were swimming in PPP money. So supposedly everybody didn't have to make these payments. It's now been 3 years. It's July in 2023, and people are still not making their student loan payments. Now, those payments are supposed to resume September 1st. Now, I don't know, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that's when they're supposed to resume. And you don't have to start getting late payments. They don't start, I guess, interest or penalty, I don't know what happens, but that doesn't start until October. So you have to start making your current payments in September, but you don't have to really start making your back payments until October, right? If you want to be able to, start paying without any interest or penalties, right? So I guess you don't even have to make your first payment in September. But again, nobody has to make the back payments. It's not like you have to make a big lump sum payment. It was just a moratorium. All your payments stopped, and all interest stopped accruing for 3 years. And so now you're just resuming. But the point is, all of these people that have student loans, and there's actually more than 1.8 trillion in student loans. That is a huge number. I mean, that's more debt than we have credit card debt, which is about 1.3 trillion. But that is a lot of debt. And there's, of course, no collateral behind the student loan debt. It's not like you could take somebody's diploma back if they don't pay the student loan, right? At least with a mortgage, there's collateral there. If somebody doesn't make the mortgage payment, you could take the property and sell it and get some money back. But if somebody doesn't make the student loan payment, it's 100% loss. There is no collateral to recover, to try to collect anything. It's 100% loss, on student loans. But that's an enormous amount of principal where there are no payments. So what have all of these people been doing with the money that they didn't use to pay their student loans? Well, they've been spending it. They've been buying food. They've been traveling. They've been buying computers or whatever. They've just been using the money. Well, what's going to happen to consumer spending when all of a sudden people who haven't made any student loan payments in 3 years all of a sudden have to start making payments? And of course, during those 3 years, the cost of living has gone way up. Prices are much higher today than they were 3 years ago. And now people don't have that extra income that they're not paying on their loans to cover those higher costs. Yes, wages are up a little bit, but not nearly as much as prices. So that means we have to see a big drop in consumer spending if people resume payments on these loans. And that's just going to accelerate the downward pressure on the economy and move us into recession. Of course, in theory, that should reduce the deficit somewhat because now the government's going to start collecting those payments. But you're not going to see that because of the increasing interest rates that are going to swell the deficit. So the deficits may increase at a somewhat slower rate because people are now paying back some of these loans to the government that they weren't paying before. But we're still going to see increasing deficits, and we're going to see increasing debt service payments as more and more low-yielding debt matures and has to roll over at these higher rates. But getting back to the Supreme Court, what also happened this week on the student loan moratorium, the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional Joe Biden's presidential decree that there'd be student loan forgiveness. And this is something, of course, that was obvious. I mean, even President Biden himself a few years ago admitted that he had no constitutional authority to forgive student loans, but then he did it anyway. And now that the Supreme Court is validating what he first said, he's acting like this is a shock. Like, how dare the Supreme Court declare this unconstitutional? Clearly, the executive cannot, by decree, wipe out debt for so many Americans, because obviously that is this like a spending bill. You're giving money to some Americans, and obviously you're putting the bill on everybody else, because if the government is going to forgive student loans, that's revenue that the government was supposed to get that it's foregoing, because all the people that have student loans were going to have to pay those loans back. And Biden forgiving the loans, well, that's like a tax cut for certain individuals. And now you're going to have much bigger budget deficits, which other taxpayers are going to have to cover. Clearly, the executive can't do that. I mean, presidents just don't raise taxes or cut taxes on their own. All of this stuff has to go through Congress. I mean, all these revenue bills have to originate in the House, and they move on to the Senate. And only after both houses of Congress have decided on this does the president get to have a say. He can either sign the bill or he could veto the bill, but he can't bypass Congress altogether and just, pass a decree. And then, the way the Constitution works, even if the president rejects a bill, he vetoes a bill that Congress passed, Congress can override his veto. But here, the president by decree decides to forgive student loans, and there's no way that Congress can override that decision. The president just stole this authority, constitutional authority that belonged to the Congress, and he just, usurped it for himself. And of course, now what is Joe Biden doing after he, realizes that he violated the Constitution? He's trying to figure out how to get around it. Well, if the Constitution says something, your job is not to try to get around the Constitution. When Joe Biden is sworn in, he swears an oath to defend the Constitution. He doesn't swear an oath to try to get around the Constitution or avoid the Constitution. He's supposed to follow it. He's supposed to obey it. And so if the Supreme Court says, hey, just in case you didn't realize this, what you're doing is unconstitutional, Joe Biden is supposed to respect that other branch, right? Because he doesn't have any respect for Congress. That's a different branch of government. Now he doesn't have any respect for the Supreme Court either, because maybe he was asleep during civics, right? 8th grade. But we have three branches of government. Biden is the executive. He's just that one branch. You got Congress and you got the Supreme Court. Well, apparently Biden doesn't care about Congress or the Supreme Court. He just wants to, be a dictator as the executive and just decide what he wants to do. And he doesn't want the other branches of government to have any say in the matter. And that just shows you, the type of president that we're dealing with here. Now, in addition to that ruling, which was a good ruling, by the way, in fact, the Supreme Court came out with some good rulings for a change. And this is one of the things, I've given President Trump, I criticize him for a number of things, but one of the things at least he did a good job of was his Supreme Court picks, right? Because his Supreme Court nominees, they're coming down on the right side of these decisions. None of these are unanimous decisions, by the way, so you still have these justices that want to ignore the Constitution and just push a radical left-wing agenda through the court. But you have justices who take their oath seriously and are striking down unconstitutional laws. Now, they're not taking it so seriously that they're unwinding a lot of really, really bad precedent. Of course, these cases aren't really before them anyway, so they're not even ruling on some of this stuff. But we got some other good decisions that came down. Another one was on affirmative action at colleges and universities, particularly the Ivy League like Harvard. The Supreme Court came out and said that discriminating against people based on their race is wrong. That it violates, the civil rights laws. And of course, a lot of people are very upset about this because they want colleges to discriminate based on race. And they think the fact that the Supreme Court says they can't is somehow a loss for the civil rights movement, because colleges have to actually not discriminate based on race. And of course, what they were doing is they were discriminating against Asian Americans or Caucasian Americans in favor of African Americans or Hispanic Americans. And the Supreme Court says, well, that's wrong. If you can't discriminate based on race, then you can't discriminate based on race. You can't, discriminate against some races, but not other races. That wouldn't be treating all the races equally. Now, of course, the Supreme Court narrowed this to public universities and universities that are accepting government money. So private universities that accept government money or that have students that are taking, government loans, which is, another reason why I don't like government, getting involved in everything, because once they give you money, they kind of own you and they can dictate what you can do. Now, in this case, it's not a bad thing that they're saying you can't discriminate based on race, but the government is able to do a lot, like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. The reason that they were able to enforce that, once upon a time, a lot of you younger listeners might not remember that it was 55 was a national speed limit. Now, clearly, the U.S. government doesn't have the constitutional authority to set a national speed limit on, state roads. But the reason they were able to do it is they said, well, everybody gets federal highway funds. And if you want to keep getting your highway funds, you got to have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And if you don't have the speed limit, we're going to take away your highway money. And so it really became a federal law by extortion, which I think was still unconstitutional, but that's how it happened. I mean, you accept the government money, the federal government money, and now they get to dictate, how you have to operate. And so kind of the same thing with these universities. If you're going to be beholden, if you're going to take government money, well, then you got to do what the government tells you. And that gives the government a lot more control because they control the money, and so they control you.